Hi everyone, my name is Madison Blompier. I'm the Director of Business Development and Strategic Relations here at Emulait, and we're having a really important discussion with our experts, Mike and Bob. We're going to be talking a little bit about breastfeeding, bottle feeding, the design behind our bottle, and really delving a little deeper into how Emulait started. So Mike and Bob, thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. So Mike, thank you for speaking with me today. As an academic, someone who has devoted so much of their life to researching breastfeeding, your achievements are so impressive. I would love to know a little bit more about your background, if we could delve a little deeper. I know you have so much published work out there, handbooks on breastfeeding. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you started with Emulait?
I'm very happy to do so. I came to the field of breastfeeding. My original qualification was non-medical. It was in zoology, and I specialised in animal behaviour. And a project came up, was dreamt up by two people, one in Oxford, one in Durham, and they were charged with the task of trying to find out what the breastfed baby eats. And we all know the breastfed baby has breast milk, but what's the composition and how much milk do they get? And they needed somebody with expertise in looking at the interaction between the mother and her baby. Now, traditionally, obstetricians look after the baby, obstetricians look after the mother, paediatricians look after the baby, and neither of them has responsibility for looking at the interaction between the two. So I was brought in with my animal behaviour skills to look at that interaction between the two. And I ended up spending 43 years researching breastfeeding. Every single aspect of breastfeeding we've looked at pretty well. And at one stage I also took on the role of National Director of UNICEF's Baby Friendly Initiative in the UK when we got that system off the ground in the UK. So that's a little bit of my background.
Amazing. And you were running outpatient clinics to support women breastfeeding, right?
Yes, the focus of our pure research was looking at how the almost the mechanical interaction and the psychological interaction between a mother and her baby affects the quantity of milk they take and the quality of the milk. So if a baby's thriving poorly whilst breastfed, the first thing you need to find out is, are the mechanics going okay? Is the physiology going okay? And changing things so you could improve the quality as much as the quantity of the breast milk. I mean, traditionally, when I started work, mothers were encouraged to breastfeed their babies 10 minutes each breast. Yeah. And what that can mean is they get if you like, the soup course on the first breast, the soup course on the second breast, and they miss out on the chocolate gâteau that comes at the end of each one.
Yeah.
So they're getting plenty of the volume of milk, which seems to be what everybody is concerned about, but they're failing to get the quality of the milk. So having worked out what that interaction was, we then, when I moved to Bristol, we set up an outpatient clinic to try and address problems of insufficient milk, baby crying, colic, any number of issues relating to breastfeeding going wrong. And my boss was a paediatrician, and he said he was happy for me to run this clinic. Mm-hmm. And if I found that breastfeeding wasn't the cause of the baby failing to thrive, then I'd pass the baby back to him. So we did it for about 7.5 years, I think.
That's amazing. I love that you've said this because I have a 13-month-old and I went through the exact same things when I was starting to breastfeed. The needing to feed for a sufficient enough time so they get that fatty aspect of the milk, it's huge. And I don't know how often this information is just readily out there for mums to truly understand. And when you have a baby who isn't, say, latching as great, and you're just saying, okay, as long as they've fed enough, or I think they've got enough. I love that you spoke about the importance of not volume necessarily, but the quantity, the composition of the milk. And you have published hundreds of articles out there.
A few.
A few. He's very, very modest. Yeah. Could we touch on a little bit of that and what these articles really are all surrounding?
Yes. We've done some keynote research. There was one which was published in The Lancet quite some while back, but it looked at the issue that if you stuck to a regimen, let's say of 10 minutes of breast each side, or the baby was poorly latched on or poorly positioned, what would be the impact on the baby of missing out on these high-fat calories? And they would end up taking up large amounts of, large volumes of milk, but without the fat, it tends to rush through the baby's stomach. And the suggestion was that the baby didn't have the opportunity to digest the sugars in the milk, so you'd get sugars being dumped into the baby's gut, and that would start a sort of home brewing operation in the baby's colon. So babies would have very loose, runny, explosive, noisy bowel movements and so on. And we found you could, just by changing the pattern of the way the mother fed or improving positioning, you could literally resolve the problem overnight. And there are all sorts of other things related to that. So that was a bit of a sort of a game changer in the field. And I think now everybody's thrown out limiting feeding time and so on. Then, in addition, we were one of the very first groups to do ultrasound studies of breastfeeding. And at that stage, the ultrasound equipment was very poorly developed. And looking at the films now, it's impossible to see how we actually knew what was going on. But I published an article in a journal called Midwifery, looking at the anatomy of the sucking process within the baby's mouth, and that's essentially what led me into the links with Emulait, because I have a long-standing understanding of what the process, what the physiological events are taking place in the baby's mouth while they're feeding.
Yeah.
So that's,
and I know that's where we've really leveraged you when we were designing, obviously, Emulait.
Yes.
How did you meet Emulait? What was that process like?
Right. Sheila Benzev has a close contact, Judith Shamian, who's a Professor Emeritus with the Canadian Nurses Society, and she chaired a scientific advisory board, and she was looking around for somebody with a deep knowledge of breastfeeding, and a person in Canada, Sonia Semenik, she said, well, you need to get Mike Woolridge involved, and so she got hold of me and invited me onto the team, and it's been an enjoyable interaction since. So I'm a member of the scientific advisory board for Emulait, and that's how I'm here. Yeah.
Bob, it's also a pleasure speaking with you today. You are so impressive in your career with over 47 years experience designing in the healthcare space. As our co-founder and chief design officer, could you tell us a little bit about your background as well as how you got started with Emulait?
Surely. Thank you, Maddie. It's nice to be here. I started a product design business with my wife, Judy, in 1976, out of a sense of more desperation than it was product planning. But we started a design business. A lot of that work initially starting was healthcare, but it was also more diverse in consumer products and other business-to-business type development. So we stayed with it. It was a difficult start, but we eventually started to grow and succeeded, and continued to develop more products, like even industrial type products, but healthcare was always there simply because of our proximity to probably the largest and most significant healthcare innovation center in the world. So, but the company continued to grow. We developed products that, as we did research on some of these products, we found that success rates, or failure rates more accurately, of products range anywhere from 50 to 80% of all new products that were developed failed. And I had such a failure. A product that I designed in 1985 won every major national design award that we could win. It was in Time magazine with the Deng Xiaoping Man of the Year. I was second Man of the Year, but no one remembers the second Man of the Year. Now, I'm only kidding. But that product, winning all these awards, failed in the market.
Wow.
And as a result, it was embarrassing. And so what I determined is that I had to find some way to prevent that from happening again. How could I be a better corporate servant to my clients when we're losing we're losing products, they're failing. So I learned from that. We started a research division inside the company, continued to grow. My wife decided that it was time for her to leave after about 25 years, and our son came in. And that was a nice development because with him, along with him, we developed our design firm to become an international design agency with offices in Shanghai, China, and in London, England. So we continue to grow. We developed kind of leading concepts for product development technology. And when the opportunity came through Shiloh, it was very interesting for me to be able to exercise some of these concepts into the Emulait product. But I met Shiloh in, I think it was 2011, and we helped him develop his Dario product for this company in Israel, LabStyle. And that was quite an interesting experience. We developed a friendship, and then I think it was about 6-7 years ago, Sheila came back after the Dario experience and had a concept, an idea, and a product that he wanted to have me look at. So, and we'll go into that a little bit more, but we redeveloped that friendship and that relationship, and eventually started Emulait.
Yeah, that's how Emulait came to be. And you have the most incredible story with all the children who have been in your lives. I want to just touch on this. How many children do you have? How many children have you fostered? It's important to know because you truly have been around bottle-fed babies, breastfed babies, a lot.
That is true. Now, my wife might take issue with that. She deserves most of the credit.
She deserves the credit.
Absolutely right. We have 5 children, 4 birth children, and one adopted child from Korea who has special needs. So it's given our family a very rich heritage and understanding. And I think Judy suggested that she's breastfed, I forget how many years, but it's an amazing number of years. Incredible. I was only support.
Yes. But you witnessed it, which is important. It's important to understand. Right. And how many children did you guys have in your foster?
We did.
Care?
We continued to enjoy children, and we wanted to be responsible, good citizens. So we fostered newborn infants for about 12 years. We had 60 newborns in our home.
It's crazy, isn't it? It's amazing. I'm like, 60 newborns as well is phenomenal, because it's one thing to foster a child who can somewhat take care of themselves, but for you guys to really devote that much time to fostering newborns is beyond incredible. With everything you're achieving in your career as well alongside this, it's amazing.
Those kids would find themselves in the office frequently. So, that we would tuck them away, but we kept it very professional. But it was rewarding, it was difficult, it was a challenge, but so worthwhile.
Yeah, as parenting is, you hit the nail on the head with that one. So Mike, can you walk us through the mechanics of breastfeeding and how these pertain to the design of Emulait?
Yes, certainly, very happy to. There are, I think, probably a minimum of about 7 active forces within the baby's mouth surrounding the issue of breastfeeding. But there are probably only 3 that we have to consider as significant in the context of breastfeeding and bottle feeding. And one of the important things I points to make, I think, at the outset is one that Bob himself has observed. Most standard bottle teats on the market are shaped. They've got a highly polished surface to them. They're fairly semi-rigid. They're flexible by compression on the sides, but they don't extend at all. And that means they're a very different thing to the human breast. The human breast, and we like to talk about the nipple areolar breast complex. Because in an ideal world, the baby takes a complete mouthful of the breast, and this is actually critical to the issue that you address of latching and attachment. The baby doesn't just need the skin of the nipple, they need all the tissues lying behind it. So, so the force involved, one is the baby generates baseline suction. I mean, anybody who tries to pull a pacifier or a finger out of the baby's mouth, or even the breast, you know, you have to break the seal.
You break the seal.
Because there's huge levels of suction. So that the baseline suction is crucial. But then in addition, the thing that the baby brings to this table is it has jaws which can clamp on the base of the tissue it has in its mouth.
Yeah.
And it has this wave-like compression action of the baby's tongue, which starts at the tip of the tongue and rolls all the way back, going off the back of the tongue. And any milk that comes out from that process obliterates the suction.
Yeah.
So the baby has to reapply the suction in a cyclical manner in order to maintain, keep it, you know, within the mouth. If milk kept on issuing and the baby didn't regenerate the suction, gradually the nipple would just slip out of the baby's mouth and so on. So those 2 things go hand in hand. And I suppose the comparison is with a breast pump. A breast pump can remove milk either by a cyclical action or not, but it still has to be reapplied because as milk comes out of the breast, the suction tails off. But the key thing is a breast pump does not have jaws, and it does not have a tongue making these wave-like movements. So the big difference is when the mother, you all be familiar, has a letdown or milk ejection reflex, which means she's always pushing milk from her breast down towards the nipple. But at the start of the active sucking cycle, the baby will clamp its jaws at the base of the breast. And at that point, all the milk available to it is captured within the ducts within the nipple.
Wow.
And the question is then, how does it get out? You know? And given that all the tubes and ducts within the nipple are terribly thin, elastic things, if you simply apply suction at the end, nothing's going to happen. It'll just collapse those ducts. So you actually need that tongue pressure to squeeze the milk towards the nipple tip, and it actually sort of pushes it out.
Interesting.
But then a group based in Australia, in Perth, they found that the baby the third key force is a sort of localized added suction, so they can preferentially draw down the middle section of the tongue. That generates more suction at the nipple tip, and that seems to facilitate the process of milk extraction. So you've got these 3 things working in combination. Now, for some reason, the Australian team have denied the existence of peristalsis, of wave-like tongue movements, and they say that this added suction is the sole thing for getting the milk out. Which is frankly crazy, but anyway, it's ignoring 650 years of previous observation of the process of how it happens. But, you know, it's a modern thing. Essentially what we strove to do was to create a bottle made out of, with the teat made out of very flexible, elastic materials, so that just like the breast, not only is it compressible, but it extends in length within the baby's mouth. And that means the baby can utilize what we would call active suckling, this process of the tongue squeezing against the object in the mouth. Is a suckling process, and it pushes the milk out rather than just sucks the milk out. So we've got a combination of suction and suckling, and the two go hand in hand. And I think it's strange that people say, which one is more important? Is it A or is it B? Because they're both important. They operate synergistically, if you like.
Yeah.
And if you take the example of getting milk from a cow, you can either use a mechanical dairy pump,
Yeah.
which uses suction, or you can hand milk them, which is a rolling, squeezing peristaltic action. Now, nobody would say when the calf takes the teat into its mouth, it only does one of those.
Yeah.
It's going to be employing both for the
Yeah.
most economic and efficient way of removing milk.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, what happens in the baby's mouth.
Yeah.
So I think the greatest advance with the Emulait project was that they asked the scientific advisory board, what principles, what precepts do you want us to build into this design? And we said, well, you've got bottle feeding at one end, you've got breastfeeding at the other, and we won't accept a compromise. We're not going for a bit of, we want it to be over here with breastfeeding.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, and they did it, and they've done it. And I think that's the beauty of it. There hasn't been any compromise along the way. They've actually produced a radically different style of product, which is different from anything else on the shelf. And there are so many other, we can go into this later, but there are so many other features that have been built into it that mean it does genuinely mimic, emulate or simulate the human breast. So it's really quite important what they've been able to do.
So Bob, obviously the design of the bottle is beautiful. It's very eye-catching, different to how we've seen bottles. Where did this idea to reinvent the bottle and how we see or look at the bottle come from?
Well, I'll say that it was very much a collaborative effort. To have a scientific advisory board on a startup company is totally rare. I mean, that is almost unheard of. And I want to give Shiloh the credit because he's an experienced entrepreneur coming from Israel, the startup nation.
Yeah.
He is the typical entrepreneur from Israel. And so he's done things very intelligently, very smart. And to create the scientific advisory board with Judith and Mike and others was really a remarkable thing to do. So what I wanted to do is to utilize one of the inventions that I'd created throughout my career in design to make sure that we don't have product failures. I want the opposite. I want total success. So I invented a technique, a research process that is akin to behavioral economics. You think Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman of behavioral economics, or the wisdom of crowds from James Surowiecki. This process looks for customer input. But beyond that, we look for technology or chemistry, science, advanced concepts that can be developed into the research. That came from our scientific advisory board. These individuals, because of their expertise, were able to generate what we call desired outcomes, measurable types of qualities, not so much solutions per se, but desired outcomes that were beyond the average consumer.
Yeah.
Because again, as a part of the effort to prevent product failure, such high failure rates, we wanted to create something unique and different. And the engagement of the scientific advisory board gave us a number, not just one or two ideas, but a number of criteria or these outcomes that were really quite remarkable. So I want to give credit to, first of all, Shiloh to create this scientific advisory board, and then give credit to the scientific advisory board, members like Mike, for coming up with these requirements.
Yeah.
Now the next thing is, what do you do with these requirements? How do you prioritize them?
Yeah.
So we did go to consumers, end users, prospective mothers, new mothers of newborns, to ask them how important each of these requirements were.
Yeah.
Because what I've learned over many years is that what customers tell you at face value, you simply cannot trust. Sadly. But it's not because they're dumb, and they're not devious. It's they're at a real disadvantage. And what I mean by a disadvantage is that when you develop a product has multiple attributes or features.
Yeah.
And when a consumer tells you what they want, typically it's a feature or attribute that is familiar to them because of their experience in the market with the existing products. But they cannot tell you what they don't know.
Yeah.
And what you don't know is what you need to create real innovation. And that came from the Scientific Advisory Board.
Yeah.
So then, with that kind of data, that kind of information, very powerful.
Yeah.
So I created an algorithm that takes this kind of information, and with the input from the actual consumers, a number of consumers, how important each one of these requirements were. We ran it through the algorithm and spit out or distilled a prioritization that
Yeah.
is typically quite different from what the consumers tell us is important at face value. And what we've learned is that what customers will tell us they want are usually what I call basic requirements. These are very important, things that are important like safety, cost, ease of use, so many other things, but it's not why people buy a product.
Yeah, it's what they expect. I remember we spoke about this. It's so interesting, the psychology behind it, because they'll say it's really important, but it's just because they know that's a base standard level. When you buy a bottle, you expect it to be safe.
Exactly.
You expect it to not be a choking hazard. They're not
Exactly.
going to go, I'm going to buy that bottle because my baby won't choke on that, versus this one, my baby will.
Exactly.
So it's so interesting, and you've developed such an incredible algorithm, because it's almost important to say, okay, so that is a mandatory feature that we need to include, but let's ignore it, because that's not going to be the reason they'll buy our product.
Exactly.
Whereas a lot of people, I think, prioritize things that are just basic requirements, and then it doesn't give them a distinguishing factor over their competitors.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So by listening to the consumer, it's typically called the voice of the customer, or being customer-centric is a great idea. It's a very important idea. But what's interesting in the last 30 years are failure rates of new product in this country
Yeah.
has not changed.
Yeah.
We want to do the best by listening to the consumer, but the problem is this algorithm is not considered. The multiple features and attributes that a product must embody, it is difficult for the consumer to put all those features and attributes, cycle it through their mind in terms of what's most important for me to buy. When you have 20 different attributes, you can't do that.
Yeah.
It's just, we don't have the mental capacity
To do
to
it.
make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah.
We can do it with 2 or 3. You walk down an aisle, you look at a product, you look, I want these nutritional features and benefits at this price, at this brand, and I can make those decisions, but with 20 requirements, it's nearly impossible.
It's difficult.
So the algorithm then distilled out of those 20-some requirements from the Scientific Advisory Board a prioritization. The highest prioritization for the basic requirement, fully expected, is do not create a choke hazard.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what consumers told us or rated as an important requirement was that it be aesthetically attractive, not only to the baby, but to the maternal caregiver.
Interesting.
And at face value, that was right in the middle.
Wow.
But the algorithm moved it to the absolute number one position.
Interesting.
So again, in my career, I've done hundreds of these projects, and never had I had a product move at the aesthetic or the design
Yeah.
move to number one position. This is really unique. And
It
because we're dealing with life, with the passion that mothers and caregivers have for an infant and these children, it's very emotional. So it makes sense
Yeah.
that the algorithm moved to that position.
And I think because there hasn't been any developments in the bottle industry, and our bottles all look the same, more or less, that we see since introducing Emulait to the market, these mothers are so drawn to purely the appearance of it. Before they know the science behind it, before they know the mechanics of the design of the bottle and any benefits it has, it's just aesthetic, and they're looking at it like, wow, this looks like a breast. This is crazy.
Can I come in
Yeah,
here?
please.
Because I want to ask you a couple of questions.
Yes.
As a woman who has herself breastfed,
Yeah.
there will have been anxieties, concerns at the start. Am I going to be able to do this? What sort of things were at the forefront of your mind in terms of anxieties? Because you can carry them over to the product as well. So.
Exactly. So I think, and I'm sure a lot of mums can relate to, everything I felt and went through, I'm sure most mums do. I was always told before, while I was pregnant, before having given birth, don't worry about labor, breastfeeding's the hardest thing. Breastfeeding is what you have to worry about. It's really difficult, it's really painful, it's really challenging. So I already went into it thinking of failure, and will I produce enough milk, which, as we know, all these things aren't helping with a breastfeeding experience. Adding all these anxieties isn't going to help you succeed. So I tried to block it all out, and I was pleasantly surprised with the breastfeeding experience I had, because I didn't have pain. I had a really incredible bond with my baby, and I loved it. I didn't expect to love it. So before that, I was told, don't buy one bottle, buy multiple bottles, because you don't know what your baby likes. Don't buy 2 of this brand, 3 of this brand. Don't get a batch, get a couple of different brands. So I had like 7 different brands of baby bottles, 1 of each just in the house, ready to
You obviously thought
give to the
breastfeeding
baby.
was going to succeed.
So I think a lot of mums are driven into this fear purchasing of, before we've even tried one bottle in our baby's mouth, we're out here getting 5 different brands of bottles just because we don't know. And we've seen this in our market. So many mums have babies who will reject bottles. So
Well,
many.
this is the point I wanted to get onto, because one of the key issue processes we haven't discussed, but you're probably familiar with
Yeah.
the term nipple confusion.
Exactly.
And it sort of runs rife through social media as
Yeah.
being a genuine anxiety.
Yeah.
It's not strictly clinically proven, but it's a sufficient concern. And that's largely because if the breastfeeding experience for the baby is unsatisfactory,
Yeah.
and somebody starts offering bottles or a pacifier, the baby looks about, which you're going to have. You're going to have this. Oh, I'll have this if that's the case.
Of course.
And that's there from then. They often then reject the breast
Yep.
in favour of the bottle. So the whole driving ethos behind this was also, the closer you can make the bottle teat to the mother's breast, the less chance there is of this nipple confusion and breast rejection. And that was also an important criterion. And if it was only a halfway house, there still was the risk. So
Yeah.
that's why so many features have been built into this product to make it as close as possible to what the baby would naturally feel and
Yes.
take into its mouth. So the texture, the feel in the mouth, all these things, they've been designed in to make sure that the baby can discriminate as least as possible
Exactly.
between the two.
Try and trick the baby.
Well, not to,
Which
but
we know is next to impossible to do.
Yes.
These babies are very
but
smart.
let's say that the dad chooses to give food by
Of
bottle,
course.
and then if there's a stark contrast between what the dad does and what the mother does, that can exaggerate the baby's potential to reject one in favour of the
Of
other.
course.
So that's a key issue, and I know you will have been familiar with the whole
Yes.
just talk about that.
Which when starting to breastfeed, my concern was, what if my baby never takes the bottle? So I was more, when do I offer the pacifier? When should I introduce the bottle? Once I had established breastfeeding and I had an incredible breastfeeding experience, the new anxiety crept in of, what if he'll never go back to breast, after he takes a bottle. So you feel like you can't win, and I think the commonness to all of this is that the bottle has been almost the enemy introducing in a breastfeeding experience. Whenever you're introducing the bottle, it's either going to cause your baby to prefer this or they're going to reject it. This is the first time that we've invented a bottle that is there to work in parallel with the breastfeeding experience and give mum the break when she needs it and enable dad, grandparent, caregiver, whoever to feed the baby still in a really intimate way that still symbolizes mum and that experience.
That's a really important point you've made, because I don't like the term nipple confusion, largely because the baby's never confused. The baby knows exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
But just as you can get a baby that switches its preference to the breast of the bottle, you can get a baby who's so hooked on breastfeeding they'll never accept a bottle. So I think acquired teat preference is almost a better term, because you can go in both directions. But again, by having a product that's close to the breast, you make it more likely the baby will accept something, and the mother doesn't have this battle or fight on her hands to try and get the baby to switch over when she wants to resume work and so on. So I think that those are important issues.
And I like that you've said more likely to switch, because it's not a guaranteed situation. Every baby is obviously different, and it's almost impossible to create a product that will work for every child. We were just speaking earlier about diapers and how one diaper brand works incredibly for my friend and didn't work for me, and it's crazy how every product, I feel like, in the baby industry is very specific to the child, but what we've done is made a solution that is a lot more likely than what's out there. And nothing's guaranteed, but at least if you try this, you're trying the closest thing to breast. I did want to talk a little bit about nipple confusion as well, and I've heard it doesn't exist. It's a coined term that is thrown around a lot between mothers, a lot on social media. Do you believe it's a flow preference? Is that what nipple confusion is?
I do believe it is an entity. It's not strictly proven, but I have no doubt that it happens. And I can give you a scenario that could suggest how it comes about. When the baby is in utero, when the mother's pregnant, that baby is drinking amniotic fluid. So it's sucking and drinking, and so obviously it's not breathing while it's a fetus. But if that baby were exposed, a lot of them, on ultrasound, you can see they've got a thumb near their thing, they've got a finger near their mouth, or the heel of their hand. If they acquire a sort of sucking modality in utero, where they're used to having a small, rigid, discrete object in their mouth, suddenly they're born and it's gone. Where's it disappeared to? And then they're presented with a breast that is flat, there's no prominent nipple, the mother is engorged. It's really difficult for the baby to get that, to take a mouthful and get that same gratification. And if after 3-4 days of battling, and the midwife's trying to help, and the midwife's being aggressive and holding the back of the baby's head and pushing against the breast, the baby develops an aversion. I don't want that. And then suddenly somebody offers a bottle teat, and they go, thank God, why are these humans so stupid not to offer? And the baby switches its preference very, very quickly. So it's a combination of the breastfeeding isn't going well for the baby, it's not getting the gratification, and something is offered instead which does give them gratification. And the parallel is work carried out by Nico Tinbergen, who was a professor of animal behaviour. And he wants to know, what was it about, this was a beach nesting bird called the oyster catcher. He wants to know, what was it about the eggs that caused the bird to sit and incubate them, because they basically look like pebbles on a beach. So how does it decide which pebbles to sit on and incubate and so on? So he replaced their clutch of 3 eggs with a clutch of 5 eggs, and every time they went to the 5 eggs, because there were more than the 3. And then took 1 egg and a large egg, like a small football, and painted it like a oyster catcher egg, and they would incubate that instead. And these are called supernormal stimuli. Nobody expects people to come along and create things that are bigger than your own clutch of eggs.
Yeah.
But I think that's what pacifiers and bottle teats are. They're a supernormal stimulus.
Yes.
And they're so physically solid, it's almost difficult for the baby to refuse it. It just fits in there like a key in a lock.
Yeah.
And so they can easily get hooked on them. And again, that's the beauty of this. This should have the same hooking ability, that makes the baby switch from the breast and go off the breast in favour of bottle teat.
Yeah.
So I do believe in the notion of nipple confusion.
Yeah.
And there are other scenarios, but it's a function of the fact that whenever you're given a choice, you don't know whether I'm expected to go with both, or are you actually asking me to choose one over the other? And I think that's sadly what the babies can do.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's interesting. The first time I gave my son a bottle, it was a slow flow newborn bottle, and I had been feeding him 15 minutes each side, and he finished the bottle in 3 minutes, and my jaw was on the floor. My husband's going, "Do you think he's choking?" I'm like, that was impressive. And we were like, but it's slow flow. And it was, the flow for us was like the craziest thing. And I remember speaking to lactation consultants who had said they don't actually need a faster flow.
Yeah.
They don't, and he's now almost 14 months, and I've never, for the time being, when I'm away and he's given a bottle, he's never progressed to a fast flow. He's still on the same newborn anything that he would be.
That's important advice in relation to using these bottles. If a mother should always start off with a slow flow version.
Yes.
Because we don't want the baby to go from a medium flow breast to a fast flow bottle.
Yes.
It's going to give it too much reward. So starting off with a low flow is important. So yes, starting off with the slow flow rate is crucial.
Mike, can you explain to us the importance of flow when it comes to prolonging breastfeeding, and why do they say a slower flow is important?
Okay, well, firstly, the rate of milk flow on the breast goes through a massive range. When the mother has an active milk ejection, it can actually be sort of streaming out of the mother's breast.
Yeah.
And then as the feed goes on, it gets progressively slower. It rarely tails off completely, but you can see the baby reacting. They go from continuous sucking to sucking in short, fast bursts. Yeah. And that's your cue to the fact that the pace of flow is getting slower. Now, babies are really neatly designed. You won't be surprised to hear this, but they're really good at detecting when the rate of milk flow from the breast has dropped off completely. Yeah. And they say, right, there's no point in me staying. And they detach from the breast because they hope they'll be off on the other side. Yeah. But certainly the trying to copy or mimic the rate of flow of milk on the breast is quite difficult. In contrast, I think something like 95% of standard bottle teats have got a single terminal hole in the nipple, and that determines the rate of milk flow. Yeah. So the market comparison is 95% of bottle teats that have a single rate of flow. It's set at 1 month, and then you change it at 3 months, etc. So it's what is currently available is really pretty artificial, and the innovation that's been built into this, I'll leave Bob to explain, because it really is something quite superb and innovative.
Yeah, Bob, if you can talk us through the 3 flow control valves and how this has gone off of what Mike said, been integrated into the design of the bottle.
Surely. Well, to be very candid, Shiloh was very insistent that we have intellectual property around flow rate from the very beginning. So as a key stakeholder, we look at consumers as our stakeholders primarily, and we can segment that to mothers and secondary caregivers, but one of the key stakeholders, which is our CEO, really required that we wanted that intellectual property. So we developed several concepts around the idea of adjusting and being able to adjust the flow rate. But I think it's in the realm of our scientific advisory board in terms of what that flow rate is, because we could design a mechanical valve, and we did, we had a design that was totally different than what we have today.
Yeah, I remember.
And we finished that design. You could literally dial the rate at which the child, that the mother perceived the child taking at this rate. But then there was an issue or a concern in terms of, it might have been usability or the way to take the nipple off of the bottle, make an adjustment, put it back on. Something didn't seem right about that concept, so they asked us to take a look at the valve again. So we did that, and we wanted to meter the flow through the valve itself, but then as it moved into the teat, again we saw in diagrams, illustrations, anatomical illustration, the number of lactiferous ducts. There were several. It wasn't just one, which is what we have today in typical bottle nipples, one hole. So we determined that if there were multiple lactiferous ducts, there must be multiple openings at the tip of the teat. So that was the rationale, again, to mimic the human anatomy as closely as we possibly could.
Yeah.
So that was the rationale.
And more on that, just while we're talking about the nipple itself, we have the multiple holes. We can see the bumps in the flow controls as well, emulate similar to what a breast looks like around the areola. The lactiferous ducts, let's talk about these and our interior fibers a little bit, because I know there's a lot of questions around these. This is something that truly has never been done before. What was the intent behind these little fibers if no milk is flowing through them?
Sure. One of the original concepts that came from Shiloh was to scan a human breast and then to 3D print a custom version, so that every mother would have the exact replica of her breast. We found that the technology really wasn't in a place where we could do that effectively. But within the 3D printing technology was the ability to create internal meshes that could not be done by conventional manufacturing techniques. But the idea of an internal mesh was that inside the human anatomy is not air or hollow. Yeah. There's tissue, there's ducts, there's, well, you know far better than I what's in there. But what we wanted to do is to create a consistent mouth feel for the baby.
Yeah.
So we needed to put something inside that could be manufactured and molded. And again, as the designer, I wanted the aesthetic, the appearance, the beauty of the product. But by the same token, we had to be cognizant of the ability to actually manufacture on a cost-effective basis.
Of course.
So that's where the idea of these
Interior fibers?
Interior fibers, and I don't know that we've come up with a true definition or a term.
Noodles, there's
I've been
many
calling
terms
it,
being thrown around tubercles.
I've been calling it tubercles, but the idea there was to create this texture and this feel of something inside, but that would allow the milk to flow in and around that to the openings.
Yeah. I think as well, it's so important to note these because it shows how intentional the design has been. From the outside, it looks and feels like a breast. People touch the nipples and they're like, this is crazy. But you've really emulated what the breast feels like internally in the baby's mouth. And it's just going that step further in mimicking how breast feels, interacts, and is really involved in the baby's mouth. It's truly incredible.
Well, we mentioned at the start the issue of active suckling.
Yeah.
I mean, for the baby, who has this magnificent tongue that is a transducer of milk flow, can detect all sorts of things, for it suddenly to be based around a hollow bottle teat is crazy. And,
Yeah.
and I thought, we needed to have something, some fibres or something behind the nipple that would give the baby the same textual feel in its mouth.
Yeah.
But I, with my sort of tunnel vision, I completely excluded it as a possibility. I thought, we can't build microtubes for the milk to flow through. How are you ever going to clean it? And then they came up with this idea. I said, but how's it going to work? I said, well, the milk will flow around the tubes.
Of course, that's also a possibility.
That's also a possibility.
I think people got so caught up in it when they first saw it that how are we going to clean these? And it is not there as a functional tube. It's there just to mimic the feel in the baby's mouth.
Which is functional from the baby's perspective, not necessarily
from the milk ejection.
Yeah. And it was intriguing. The first prototype had just 3 or 4 tubes, and as you squeezed it, they just rolled. They clicked backwards and forwards. But then they thought, well, let's put a random array in.
Yes.
And suddenly, when it's a random array, different sizes, it behaved much more like the nipple. So there are crucial design features. But I think that's one of the most innovative features of this.
I agree.
And you alluded to this earlier on the valve. Because of the thin wall nature, the softness and elasticity, there's the potential that as the infant clamps down on the teat walls, that softness could shut off the flow of milk, but it also, with the vacuum, it has the tendency to have the nipple protract down into the bottle. So the valve itself created an arcing support underneath that soft nipple.
Yeah.
And when we did that, because of the the translucent quality of the material, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to create these little protrusions on the valve that mimics the Montgomery glands in the areola complex?
Yeah.
So you can actually see this. If you hold the bottle up, you can see the Montgomery gland protrusions. That a number of these ideas and these concepts just fell into place.
Yeah.
Even with traditional manufacturing, I mean, this hard, cold sense of steel manufacturing tools to create something so warm and so familiar.
Yeah.
It was tricky. It was a mind stretching activity.
It's a beautiful juxtaposition when you think about what creates these beautiful, very feminine, very realistic bottles. They're beyond amazing, and I think everybody has that same reaction when they touch and feel it, and they feel the bumps and they feel the interior fibers and they see how it stretches. They almost ask, they're like, can I touch it? Like, it feels so lifelike. It is amazing.
It will create problems for certain people. Now, I don't know whether you've ever seen nurses feeding babies in NICU or somewhere like that, but a baby that's half asleep, you can wriggle and infiltrate a bottle teat into the mouth. You just push it between the baby's lips. You can't do that with the breast.
Yeah.
The baby has to be alert and hungry and awake, and when they make that gape, you can present the breast and so on. So that's going to have to be the same thing that's going to need to be learnt. You'll need to stimulate the baby's lips and its tongue to make that gape before the bottle is offered. You can't infiltrate this into a baby's pursed lips. So there will be a change in sort of philosophy, but everything is much more like normal natural breastfeeding.
Exactly, and that's a great transition as well. I love that you mentioned this because we've spoken about it in our videos as well, where people can scan, because we want to trigger that rooting reflex and stroke it just above the lip, because you're right, it is so like the breast. It's not like a bottle. You can't slide it in there. They do really need to latch on. They need to do the work to extract the milk from our bottles. And a lot of babies aren't going to like this. There is going to be a bit of a learning curve. A lot of babies are going to go, what? Why isn't it just flowing into my mouth? I have to truly suckle. What benefits do you see in the Emulait bottle, and the fact that they do have to work harder? What benefits does this give baby? Because I know a lot of women who are breastfeeding, they see the value in Emulait immediately. But for those who aren't breastfeeding, why would they choose an Emulait bottle?
Well, I wouldn't say they're going to have to work harder on this. They will probably get the milk more easily, but it'll be less gratifying in tactile terms in their mouth. And I'm going to throw in another bit of important science at this point. Every single behavior that you and I do that is rhythmic, it could be walking, it could be breathing, if it was birds, if it would be flying, if it was fish, it would be swimming. Every single rhythmic movement has a central pattern generator in the brain that gives out that sort of metronomic-like beat that drives breathing. And there's exactly the same thing for sucking. So the baby has a central pattern generator for sucking. And that is geared to the baby taking a flexible breast into the mouth. And there's been a study that looked at different types of bottle teats used on a NICU, and the stiffest one caused chaotic, disorganized feeding because the baby couldn't strip that inflexible teat in line with its pattern generator. They would, it threw it off its course. So basically the solution to that is to take it as far away from a stiff teat towards a soft teat, which is what this is. And so it may well be the case that unless a baby has already had weeks or months of feeding on a bottle, that maybe bottle feeding a baby with this from the start will, again, fall in line with the baby's natural pattern generation in terms of the metronomic beat that's driving the process. And I think that's a crucial additional step.
Yeah.
So.
And does breastfeeding, or in this case, if we've tried to mimic breastfeeding, does it help with the baby's oral development and strengthening their jaw muscles? Is that something that's usually hindered by a regular stiff bottle?
Yes, there is evidence that use of stiff bottle teats and pacifiers is associated with overbite, dental malocclusion predominantly. And I can explain that by the fact that when the baby takes the breast into their mouth, the breast expands to fill the internal geometry of the baby's mouth.
Right.
With a bottle teat, that bottle teat doesn't do that. Instead, the soft tissues of the baby's mouth collapse around the bottle teat. So it distorts the baby's mouth.
Right.
And of course, this situation only gets worse as the baby grows. As its mouth gets bigger, the baby can take more breast into their mouth.
Yeah.
Whereas as the baby gets bigger and it's the same size teat, they end up collapsing more and more. So it constrains mouth development. It keeps on pulling it back to this same standardized rigid format, which again, this should completely overcome because the baby can take, as small or as large a mouthful as it wants.
Yeah.
And the trick will be to get it not just to sort of sit at the base of the cone, but to actually take a mouthful with its lips well back with the areola.
As much of the bottle in its mouth as possible. Bob, we talk about Emulait being a biomimetic bottle. Can you explain a little bit more about biomimicry and how it's used in different environments and why we've applied it to our bottles here?
Surely. So biomimicry is something of an innovation tool that product developers have discovered. And it's easy by observation to look around nature to see all kinds of incredible, diverse design, from animal behavior, animal physiology to plant life. Designers have used biomimicry as a form of inspiration. For us, again, the results, the outcomes that were requested and suggested by our scientific advisory board almost dictated biomimicry. So it was not something that I necessarily decided to do as another design tool, but is something that just naturally flowed from the requirements that came from the board. We are copying the human anatomy in a way that is totally different than the way typically other bottle manufacturers have done.
Yeah.
I equate it to something like these are engineering solutions to fluid transfer. And it seems cold, it seems impersonal. And what we wanted to do is something totally different, is to use empathy to try to experience the relationship between mother and child as something of an experience. So we approached the design and the development of this product from the experience, the emotional, the empathetic style and directive, rather than just this cold, indifferent, mechanical function, engineering function, to something that was much more emotional and satisfying.
Yeah.
So again, biomimicry was something of a byproduct of the directives that we were given.
Yeah, amazing.
A distinction I'd like to make, and why I'd like to coin the new word biomimesis, is because biomimicry is about taking something from one context and applying it in another.
Mm-hmm.
So a bird's wing is a good design for an aerofoil, for a plane's wing and so
Yeah.
on. And you can design a helicopter rotor blade gyroscopes based on dragonfly's wings.
Yeah.
We're not designing a dragonfly, we're designing a helicopter, and we're picking bits of the design of a dragonfly to operate the helicopter. So they're analogues. In our case, we're going for a homologue, something that actually performs and behaves just like the human
Just
breast.
like
So
it.
that we're using a human breast to design something that operates as close as possible to the human breast. So that's not strictly biomimicry. It's a more holistic approach to the thing, and that's why I'd like
Metamorphosis.
biomimesis, maybe.
I like it. I like it.
Yes, interesting.
And our silicone, we were touching on before how the need for the nipple to stretch and elongate.
Yes.
Our silicone, which we've spoken about, it's a lot thinner than a regular nipple. Can you talk us through the silicone we use and why it is so different to other bottles?
Surely. When we, again, first started, it was my dream to create a proprietary material that was totally unique from conventional bottle manufacturers. So we dreamed of this softer, flesh-like material. It would probably be some sort of a hybrid of silicone or other type materials. But as a startup company, we did not have the kind of monetary resources that would give chemical manufacturers, material manufacturers, the incentive that we simply couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
And we didn't have the credibility. Nobody had ever heard of our company at that time, which was Proximama rather than Emulait. But, and the other part is that to create such a new material would be 2, 3, 4 years in development, and then another year or so, maybe an FDA to get approval.
Of course.
So we simply could not do a proprietary material. So we were forced to come back to the existing standard silicone materials that are in the industry. Now those materials had different softness grades called durometer. So we wanted to use the softest durometer that we could possibly find. We talked to manufacturers about the potential of adding new materials, new additives, but then again, that would change the chemical composition, which would require an FDA approval. So again, we were stuck with the idea of having to use these conventional materials. What we were insistent on was maintaining the softness and the elasticity. And the only way we could do that is to do a thin wall section using the softest durometer that was available commercially and was approved. But that had the adverse effect and problem of preventing a child from puncturing, biting, and tearing the product. And as a result, I believe that most manufacturers would mitigate that by creating a harder durometer and a thicker wall section so that a child with the teeth pattern, the eruptions of a 9-month-old or older could actually pierce that material. And Mike alludes to the concept of a risk that we were taking and a very delicate balancing act of trying to keep these qualities of softness and elasticity with the ability to prevent a tear or a bite and presenting a choke hazard. We struggled with that through the entire development process. We knew that that was a risk going forward to try to create this soft, thin material. But we always had the strategy that we would approach this problem by doing this thin wall solution with the notion that we would design what's called steel safe condition, that if we had to modify the tool to create a thicker wall section, we could do that without starting completely over in the tooling. So we always had the ability to increase the durometer, the rigidity of the material, and the wall thickness. But we literally went right down to the wire of this risk. And the reality is that we failed the bite test 4 times. And each time we made a modification to the tool, adding a material thickness only in the area where we knew the child's incisors would be able to reach, and we changed those thicknesses to the point where we have eventually passed the test, but still retained the elasticity and the softness that we're looking for. Now, that softness creates some other characteristics, physiological characteristics, and performance characteristics that we had to solve with the valve, which we did. So it was a balancing act. It was tricky, and there was a whole element of risk that I think most of the company did not realize, but we did it. It worked.
And I think you can probably see that it's completely the reverse ethos of the standard bottle teat manufacturer. The vast majority, if not all, bottle teats and pacifiers have got a constriction, they've got a neck, which is exactly where the baby's jaws fit. And as teeth develop, you have to make sure the baby doesn't bite through that and take the thing. But it doesn't serve any other function, so you make it basically the same thickness and the same strength over the whole body of the teat and so on. Which means if it's a bottle teat, it's not very useful for getting milk out of. So I think the safety factor can actually drive the design of the teat in an unsatisfactory direction unless you take an alternative approach to it.
Exactly. That's right.
Bob, people keep asking us, where are the vents? Can you explain how the Emulait bottle reduces air swallowing and what is unique about our design?
Okay. As with all bottles, and unlike the natural anatomy, I mean, the breast has no volumetric air. So it's totally different. So every bottle, regardless of its shape or its characteristics, requires a venting process. Our vents, the air comes into the bottle through the threads of the bottle, and then a circumferential valve, one-way valve, that is hardly recognizable. It's all invisible, but it allows the air to ingress, come into the bottle to neutralize that vacuum pressure created by the extraction of the milk and the vacuum that's created. So it's all hidden, it's all invisible.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are used to seeing all these anti-colic bottles and everything's external or the vents, and it's very, very unique in how it's been designed to be anti-colic and reduce all that.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued that you use that term because that's what everybody refers to these bottles as anti-colic. My personal view is that Emulait needs to be engaging in this discussion and make sure they call it aerophagia, which is air that you take in by mouth. And I think that is completely different from what comes out of the baby's bottom. Those are two separate processes. I mean, there's some evidence in adults with clinical conditions that they can, over-consume air and it goes all the way through the system. But for the majority of the stuff that's in the baby, the air they take in by mouth needs to be brought up by winding or burping, and end of story. It doesn't go all the way through and come out the other end and so on. The wind that comes out of the other end, as I've already said, is wind generated in the gut by fermentation of sugars that shouldn't have got there in the first place.
Right.
So I think I like the fact that Emulait is also trying to take a different educational approach and using words like aerophagia rather than anti-colic. I think that's quite useful.
It is, and it's funny you bring it up. We've done posts on social media as well to educate about this. The anti-colic is anti-crying. Colic is the crying for 3 or more days consistently. And it's so interesting how these terms just become coined and everybody catches on. And I think there's a fine line between understanding that that's what most people understand, but also doing our best to educate that it is aerophagia and that that's what we really need to be talking about, because colic is just crying, and the anti-colic term is almost implying it's anti-gas, it's anti-air swallowing.
Yes.
And
well, then we need to call it anti-crying.
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 Our bottles are anti-crying.
But you see, people say, oh, you can't use new terms. And yet every mother's buying a BPA-free bottle, not knowing what bisphenol A, what is it? No. So you don't actually need to know what it is you're trying to avoid.
As long as they hear enough of it and we start the conversation, I think it'll catch on. So Mike, after all your time as an infant feeding expert, what was it about Emulait's vision that really appealed to you?
That's interesting because throughout my 43-year career as a researcher into breastfeeding, we could not accept research funding from formula manufacturers, bottle manufacturers, teat manufacturers, even breast pump manufacturers, because they theoretically could compromise the story.
Right.
Having put my career behind it, I've always been sensitive to the fact that, people will condemn a bottle teat manufacturer or condemn a nipple shield manufacturer when you actually know that their motives are in exactly the right place.
Yeah, of course.
People prejudge them unnecessarily. So when I actually heard about the aspirations of Proximama and what the scientific board, where they were headed for, I thought, yes, this is fine. I can be on board with this sort of project. And it is this issue of the primary aspiration is to extend the period of breast milk delivery for a baby. And everything that comes with that, all the health gains, the health benefits, the oral development, the maternal pattern of behaviour, the further you can extend that, the better. Yeah. And it is inevitably the case that women do want to return to work, and if they can return to work while sustaining breast milk provision, that's great. So that's if you like, that's the primary context in which the Emulait bottle should work. There are many other contexts. So gay or lesbian couples who've adopted, they may want to adopt this to achieve a more naturalistic style of feeding from the outset. But the primary objective is to extend the delivery or the manufacture production of breast milk as far into the baby's infancy as possible. So it's not trying to come up with something that competes with breastfeeding. It is the issue of extending it. And sometimes one can be careless with the words and it sounds as if you're promoting something to replace breastfeeding. No, that's not it at all. It's purely giving the mother a tool an adjunct to what she normally does to help her keep that going for as long as possible. And that's something which I found very easy to get behind, and so on. So that was what intrigued me the most.
Yeah, I like that you said tool, because that's exactly what I say. It's not there to inhibit or hinder the breastfeeding process. We are really there to support and prolong it. And I think the bottle industry in the past has got a really bad rap because of nipple confusion that isn't nipple confusion, but the bottle preference that babies end up having, and then it in turn does obviously affect the breastfeeding process. So without intentions, they have been an issue.
So let me add to that.
Yes.
One of the things that was interesting to me, and I think that I don't know if we talk about this enough, but this very idea of the benefits of breastfeeding longer that extend into adulthood. As a healthcare design development firm, my company was always interested in preventive health, wellness, and this seemed to fit that very, very, very well. So that was also very interesting to me, and I still think we may want to talk more about that in terms of the benefits that we can augment and facilitate.
Yes, I mean, I think we touched, or there was a wish to talk about what are the benefits of breast milk and breastfeeding for the infant as sort of separate entities. And we all know about the benefits of breast milk, but it's easy to gloss over what are the important key issues. Firstly, the breast milk, although only about 70% of breast milk is nutritional, everything in there is packaged in the best possible form for the baby. So in contrast, people, bottle artificial milk is 100% nutritional. That means it's missing all the other triggers or hormonal things that are necessary. So, and because if you take something like the iron in breast milk, iron in breast milk is put into a perfect molecule called lactoferrin. And it's like a baseball glove that wraps up the iron, and when it gets into the baby's gut, the baseball glove lets go, and the iron is suddenly available to the baby. It doesn't go to the bacteria in the gut, it goes straight to the baby. Now, you can't do that with formula, so they have to put in 3 times as much iron to make sure that enough gets through and into the baby. And that's why there's more, quotes, nutrition in formula, because they have to go over the top to do it. But then there's all these things in breast milk. I mean, there's epidermal growth factor, which is non-nutritional, but it helps promote regrowth of the gut wall. If the baby has an episode of diarrhea, then that will promote growth of the breast wall, the gut wall. And then there are a whole set of factors. The antibacterial factors, there are multiple types. There's antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal. There are medium chain sugars called oligosaccharides, and they basically prevent viral growth in the baby's gut. And those, they've tried to put oligosaccharides into formula, but they were the wrong ones, and they didn't do anything. So you need these true biological things to put in the milk. And there are many benefits to that, and as Bob said, the benefits go into adolescence or into adulthood. So blood pressure is one key example where you have much more functionally appropriate blood pressure throughout your life. I worry because I was bottle fed as a child, so I'm panicking about my blood pressure.
Thanks, Mum.
But also, of course, there are huge benefits to the mother. Reduction in premenopausal breast cancer, ovarian cancer. It offsets the risk of osteoporosis because when you cease breastfeeding, you go through a natural process which returns calcium to the skeleton. If you stop it abruptly, you don't get that smooth transition. So women who breastfeed actually are left with stronger skeletons at the end of the process than if they're bottle fed.
I haven't heard that. That's amazing.
So I think about obesity and diabetes as well.
Yes.
I mean, those are massive industries
They are, yes.
globally.
I mean, the obesity link or is in some aspects are tenuous, yeah, and I can't feel I can put my full weight behind it, but I can certainly come up with explanations. Artificial formula is the same constant flavour the whole time. It's a fairly constant delivery rate and so on, whereas breast milk is changing in its quality and flavours, and it gets the baby used to a diverse diet while they're receiving breast milk, and that diversity of diet translates into being a toddler and then into an adolescent, hopefully, where they actually do tolerate a much greater range of foods rather than, you know, single nutrients, you know, manufactured foods. So.
That's interesting. What I think the first thing that shocked me the most was when my son was really sick and I pumped and I was like, my milk is green. My milk was literally green, and it was just providing him with different antibodies, obviously, because, and I think that act of breastfeeding, because your body is receptive to your baby and what they need, all done by transfer of, I don't even know what, while you're breastfeeding, but your body knows and is able to deliver your infant with the necessary antibodies. That just blew me away.
You'll be familiar with the term colostrum, which is the stuff before the milk comes in. It's those immune
Liquid
factors,
gold.
liquid gold, because it's all immunity. Now that doesn't go away, it doesn't disappear. It stays there. It's like background radiation.
Right.
And you overlay it on all these mature milk components, the casein and so on and so forth. But right at the end of the process, as you gradually dies down, the very last feed you will be giving is pure immunoglobulins. So the immunity carries on, and it may not, you may have done the work in relation to measles or chickenpox, but intercurrent infections, when you say your child had you know, had problems, and it will have been something that maybe you or they had been exposed to, and you're putting the specific immunity in. So that very last feed, you're still being responsive in terms of giving immune factors to the baby. It's not that it all disappeared after day 5, you know, so that's quite an important thing to think.
So interesting. Bob, I would love you to talk us through Emulait and the design pragmatics. What does it mean? Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Now, this gets a bit, I don't know what the proper word is, wonkish from a designer's standpoint, but I've worked with some of the most amazing talent in this country, and they're very intuitive thinkers, more predominant right brain thinkers. And when a design problem is presented to them, they intuitively begin to generate ideas and thoughts about the actual shapes, the forms, the solutions. And what I found is that in these last 20 years or so, customer or patient centricity has become a key word and a term to try to increase the effectiveness or success of new product introductions.
Okay.
Sadly, that hasn't changed. But another tool that I've developed and used in the actual design, form generation, the color, material, and finish of this product comes out of design pragmatics. So in linguistics, there's the term semantics, which is the meaning of words. But also less understood and rarely heard of is the idea of pragmatics, which is the meaning of words in context. Now, in our day and age today, with the advent of artificial intelligence, what we found is that artificial intelligence as a design tool is happening. It's the only problem with artificial intelligence is that it has difficulty understanding the idea of context. You can ask it, you can tell it things that you want it to research, and its massive search capability brings up the most incredible information. And in fact, incredible designs This is actually happening now. But it doesn't understand context. And the example is children make delicious snacks. Artificial intelligence has difficulty understanding what that means, right? Whereas the human mind understands that subtlety and that context. Well, what I found is the raw talent that we saw creating these visually compelling design work. They're very intuitive, but they were not patient-centric. They were not consumer-centric. So what we began to explore is the idea of using this linguistic tool to turn it into a design tool that to create what's called design language.
Right.
Okay, so part of the process is understanding from the end user, the consumer. We talked to Tamar, Shiloh's wife, about what was the experience that was so difficult for them that it prompted Shiloh to say, we have to do something about this.
Yeah.
So I asked Tamar to write her experience and to use as much descriptive language and wording as she could. So I extracted from her testimony, from her story, keywords, and then we also asked consumers to generate metaphor. What are the different metaphors? I mean, if conventional bottles have a high flow rate, it's like fast food.
Yes.
Whereas the breastfeeding might be likened to a metaphor of fine dining or home-cooked meals. So what are the different metaphors that we explored? Well, we gathered almost 70 different metaphors, but the metaphor that came out is the bottle is my breast. So with that language, with that design language, we created forms, or I generated the form that the bottle is a breast.
Yeah.
So that's where the form generation came from, to create something that was totally unique rather than just the conventional mechanical bottle.
Yeah. I love your thought. I love delving into your genius mind and hearing the thought process behind how this came to be and the inception of the design in the bottle. It's very, very amazing.
Well, it is remarkable that this tool, this ability to convert language from purely audible language into visual language, and that's what we've intended to do, and we want to carry that through the brand as we go forward with new products.
Of course.
So it's been a very, I think, rewarding experience, because the response we've seen from social media has been overwhelming. So the biomimicry, the biomimesis, the pragmatics, it works. Our research, our synthesis, our prioritization of these attributes through the algorithm has worked amazingly as a collaborative effort with our scientific advisory board, with the directives from Shiloh and his wife Tamar, to create something that is really remarkable.
Yeah.
So it's been a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, it has.
You do realise you've just defined design pragmatics by using the term customer centricity, as if we're not familiar with design pragmatics, but we are familiar with
Yes. Well, that's why I say it gets a little wonky from a design perspective.
Is there
Design
anything
nerdy.
we didn't touch on that you want to speak about, Mike?
I don't think so. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, especially as you have the personal experience of having breastfed, which I've never been able to do, understandably and so on. But it's nice to be able to discuss these issues with somebody who genuinely understands the issues behind it and so on.
Yes. We can empathize with you, Maddie.
We appreciate it. On behalf of all mothers, I think so many women have wanted to breastfeed, haven't been able to successfully feed, haven't liked it, have decided to stop breastfeeding, and thankfully we have bottles to turn to still feed our children. But I think there are still so many women who are struggling. Their baby won't take a bottle, so they are that only source of nutrients for their child. They aren't able to leave them. They do have to return to work. There are so many instances which do require a more breast-like feeling bottle to solve these issues, and I feel so blessed to work for such an incredible company with such a intentional mission to help all these women and families. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you both today. Thank you for speaking about why Emulait came to be, how Emulait came to be, and where Emulait is going. I really appreciate it.
It's nice chatting with, listening to Bob as well, and listening to the discourse between the
Of
three
course,
of us.
I know it's been a great conversation.
Great. Thank you, Maddie, and thank you,
No,
Mike.
thank you both. Lovely.
Thank you guys.
Okay.